to the Bruno Leone Institute for the opportunity to speak this evening, and to all of you for giving me your attention as I address what Alberto correctly described as a quite controversial topic. And it's not just a controversial topic within the Austrian School of Economics. In a more general evident that should be up there, I can't tell. This critical views of fractional reserve banking, first of all, go far. There have always been critics of the institution. In the United States, for example, the Jacksonians, their leader, Andrew Jackson, and in particular, were critics of fractional reserve banking. But you can find critics of fractional reserve banking in all countries that have had much experience with it, and you can find them coming from various different perspectives. Now, for all of us in this room, probably the best known, who made some particular criticisms that are somewhat unusual, that I tend to devote some special time to today. But he's far from alone within the Austrian school. I think Alberto de Soto would be right up there with him as a known critic of fractional reserve banking. But outside of the Austrian school, of course, there are many, many other critics of fractional reserve banking today. I think you're all familiar with the Vollgeld initiative, recently resulted in a referendum in Switzerland, which was voted down, to my immense relief. I don't know how others feel about it, but you'll see my own views soon enough. But there are also free market economists outside of the Austrian school, like John Cochrane, whose picture is on the upper right-hand corner of the screen right now, who are in favor of what's called narrow banking, who want to limit banks to perhaps not holding 100% reserves, but to holding only government securities, which practically amounts to the same thing, you know, because if banks were to hold 100% reserves today in the United States, in effect, they would be directly financing government securities through the central bank, which mainly holds those on its balance sheet. So the difference between narrow banking, as it's understood, and 100% reserve banking in a fiat money context is more academic than anything. Of course, Rothbard and Puerta de Soto would favor a 100% gold system. The banking that I wish to offer applies whether it is fractional reserves on a fiat basis or fractional reserves on a specie gold or silver basis that we're talking about. I tend to offer defenses of fractional reserve banking that are applicable today. Since this is, after all, the Mises Seminario, I should point out that Mises himself held different positions, well, I should say, made different statements that could be interpreted in some cases as opposing fractional reserve. I think it's enough and safe enough to say that von Mises was a proponent of freedom in banking. However, he was a proponent of freedom in banking who appears to have believed that if you had such freedom, you would have ended up with something approximating 100% reserves. And that's an empirical claim. It happens to be quite easily falsified, that we have abundant evidence that the reality of fractional reserve, of free, as it has been practiced in the past, is one in which there have been very low reserve ratios in those countries that have freedom. But that shouldn't convince any of you yet that fractional reserve banking is fine, because you may subscribe to the view that those free banking systems weren't truly free, in part because they were systematically defrauding their customers, for example. So we still have a debate to have about that, and we will. So let us put aside what Von Mises' own views on this subject, because what really matters to us is getting down to what the evidence and facts and arguments can tell us about it. Now, the flaws, the alleged flaws of fractional reserve banking that I intend to dispute are essentially 3 or 4 in number, depending on how you group them. The first, which I said we devote some special attention to, is the view that fractional reserve banking is inherently fraudulent. Outside of the Austrian school, one doesn't hear this argument very much. But inside, of course, one hears it quite often. You've all heard it, I suppose. So certainly we want to tackle that. I have to tackle that if I'm going to make the case for fractional reserve. Second argument, which is much more popular among proponents of narrow banking from the non-Austrian persuasions, is that fractional reserve banking invites bank runs and from those full-fledged banking panics, certainly bad things. So I'll have to say something about why I think fractional reserve banking is actually innocent of those charges. Finally, we have the view, and now here again, it comes mainly from Austrian school proponents, that fractional reserves are a cause of inflation and business cycles. And of course, if you're familiar with the Austrian theory of the business cycle, you know that the common element here is excessive money creation, right? It causes inflation and causes business cycles. So if you get excessive money, claims in turn, and therefore, for the most part, the case I make for fractional reserve banking consists of refuting these arguments against it, though I also hope to say something more positive about fractional reserve banking. It won't do to say that it doesn't cause any of these problems. I'd better convince you that it actually achieves something desirable that couldn't without it. And I do plan to get around to that, but let's address these issues first. Now, in each case, I want to present the argument that I'm planning to rebut. So here I have some paraphrasing of Murray Rothbard's position on the fraud question from his book, The Mystery of Banking. You can find these same opinions expressed in other works by Rothbard or by Huerta de Soto or by numerous other Austrian school economists. I will read it to you because I realize the screen is not all that easy for people to read. What it says is that, and there are quotation marks scattered about because I'm condensing a longer paragraph. I promise you I'm not misrepresenting Rothbard. I don't think anyone will believe I am. Bank deposits and notes, quote, are simply warehouse receipts for actually deposited gold. That's a crucial premise. Banks print warehouse receipts for gold not and cannot be there. That's the fractional reserve. These are then loans. Although a banknote doesn't, quote, actually say on its face that the warehouse guarantees to keep a full backing of gold on hand at all times, the bank does promise to redeem on demand. And so when it issues fake receipts, it is already committing fraud. So this is a good fair capsule summary, I believe, of the fraud position. This should be a familiar picture to you all now, if only because you saw it in an earlier lecture. It's a nice picture. Wondered that not everybody uses it for every lecture, but anyway, here is a picture showing a medieval money transaction, obviously with some people who are in the business of trading money, probably money changers rather than bankers as we would understand them today. But the basic point I wish to make actually is one that goes back even beyond the days of modern banking. It's a principle that predates the emergence of modern Federal Reserve banks, and indeed a principle that one can find in ancient times, having to do with what it means to hand some money to a person who professionally holds it, keeps it, trades it, deals with it. And this principle is something I've labeled the bagging principle. It's very old. It has roots in ancient law through Judaic law up to modern common law and beyond. Not to say that the laws haven't evolved or adapted based on these principles. They've taken different form, but the principle is ancient and it's simple, very simple. If you went to a money changer and you gave the money changer some coins, what sort of transaction you were having with that money changer or banker or whatever depended on how you surrendered the coins. If the coins were in a sealed container, like the bag shown here, where there would normally be a wax seal or something, so the owner could tell that they hadn't been tampered with, those coins remained the property of the depositor, and I'm going to use this controversial word, I'm going to use it in a generic sense. They remained sort of the property of the depositor. They did not become the property of the banker, whose responsibility was to hold the coins for whatever purpose it was arranged with the owner of the coins, to keep them as a warehouse storage item or a bailment, as the technical term goes. That meant that the money was, those unique coins had to be preserved and returned upon request by the bailee, who had to pay a fee, of course, for this safe storage of the coins, because after all, the banker was not allowed to use the coins, which were not the banker's property and could not earn any interest. On the other hand, if coins were surrendered in loose form, it was understood implicitly, unless stated otherwise, that the coins became the property of the money changer, banker, what have you, who received them. The reasons for this, which I won't go into in any detail, had to do with the fungibility of money and the practicality of keeping track of individual loose coins. So it was always the case, again, I stress, going back to ancient times, and one can trace the cases and law, etc., manifestly making clear that it remained so for century after century, that a transaction in which someone handed loose coins to a professional money dealer made the coins the property of the money dealer, who then would have a relationship with the person who surrendered the coins, whose relationship would be with that person would be that of debtor and creditor. So we have here a debt transaction, a credit transaction, not a bailment transaction. This is absolutely generally understood. In the common law courts of England in the early days of banking there, modern banking in the mid-17th century, understood this perfectly well. By the way, if you read your Rothbard and your Corrector de Sotto carefully, you'll find that they concede that the common law courts recognized these transactions involving loose coin with bankers as debt transactions. That is, they recognized that the coins that were deposited became the property of the bankers who received them. What they say is the common law courts were wrong, which is a very odd thing for someone steeped in Austrian economics and familiar with the way the common law works to argue. And I can study the cases myself. There was nothing wrong about them. And they didn't pioneer new law, as I keep emphasizing. They merely recognized, as common law courts do, what had long been the traditional understanding. Now, if this isn't convincing enough, one only has to spend a little bit of time looking at historical or more modern banknotes and comparing them to various kinds of bailment contracts, or, if you like, warehouse receipts. If you bother to do that, you will see that they're quite different. It's easy to tell a banknote from where the note represents a debt contract or IOU from a warehouse receipt. They look and say, they look different and they say different things. Here's a typical bailment receipt. I can't remember what this one is for. It might be chests of opium or something like that. But they all look more or less the same and they have common language. They say, received from so-and-so, so many bags, barrels, bushels, chests of blah, 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 for storage, blah, blah, blah. And it couldn't be less ambiguous, could it? Right? That's a warehouse receipt. That is what a warehouse receipt looks like. I think I have another. This is a modern example from our friend Bernard, what's his last name? Just escaped me. Oh, well, I knew I shouldn't have had that glass of wine. Van Nothouse. This is a modern one, and it says immediately, the first word, this is a true money storage receipt, right? At least if we can trust Bernard, which we really might not want to all the time, but what he's claiming to have issued here is a warehouse receipt. In this case, it actually says warehouse receipt. So how can you argue with that? But if you look at banknotes, and now I'm talking about commercial banknotes. I'm not talking about central banks. All right. Here's one of the oldest ones. They all, though, have the same language. Something to the effect of so-and-so promises to pay so-and-so, or the bearer, so much money, on demand or in 30 days or whatever. That's an IOU. That's a debt arrangement. That's not a warehouse receipt. Now, what Rothbard and Bertrand de Soto and others do is to simply claim that these are warehouse receipts, and therefore, if the warehouse hasn't stored all the gold or silver or whatever, then it's engaged in fraud. Well, the premise of the argument is wrong, because they aren't warehouse receipts. They're not even pretending. They don't even look like warehouse. If they're trying to fool, if you're trying to rip off somebody by issuing a fake warehouse receipt, wouldn't you want to make it look like a warehouse receipt? Wouldn't that be the wise way to proceed? It seems to me that these fraudsters are rather clumsy about their fraud. Here's another one. I picked some old ones because I wanted to show that this was always true. It's not as if the bankers became honest later on. These are some of the oldest ones you can find. Here it is again, the Halifax Bank. This was a Canadian bank. They were good banks, by the way. I promise to pay on demand, blah, blah, blah. Same language. You won't find an exception to this. I've picked English language notes for my examples, but you will find the same corresponding language for a banconotto italiano, right? Or for a banknote from France and so on. So even today, right? One of the unique things about, by the way, the argument that conventional banking in England, for example, as it began in the 17th century, the argument that it began with fraud is actually not restricted to the Austrians. Every textbook of money and banking, or half of them anyway, in the United States, tells the story about the wily goldsmiths who were supposed to be storing money and then cheated. They discovered people weren't all coming at the same time, so why not lend a little bit? That story is very popular outside of the Austrian school as a story of the beginnings of banking. I've researched this very carefully. There's no truth to it. It's completely made up. It's true that before goldsmiths became bankers, people were used to storing their gold in the Tower of London. And guess what? The English government made off with a lot of it. It was supposed to be made into coins in return, but they needed the money. Well, that happened, but there's no record of any goldsmith having cheated his customers this way. They may have stored gold, but then they said they were storing gold, and they may have promised to store, and then they stored. But when they were giving out banknotes or deposit credits for loose coin. They were engaged in bailment contracts and they didn't, in debt contracts, and they didn't pretend otherwise. Now, some Rothbard and company are a little bit different. They claim that the fraud's been going on right up until today. So just for good measure, I've taken some text out of a standard bank depositor declaration and agreement that you can find from pretty much any US bank. They're all a little bit different in this case. But here's one that I found without great effort. And it has a line right in there. You get this when you open your account that says, unless otherwise expressly agreed upon in writing, our relationship with you shall be that of debtor and creditor. No fiduciary, quasi-fiduciary, or other special relationship exists between us. That's a debt contract. That's saying your deposit, that money you gave us, that's ours. We can do whatever we want with it that the law allows us to do because it's ours. I should have mentioned to you. If the money becomes the banker's property, that means that they can use it the way they want to, which means they can lend it, right? I thought that was implicit, but I did want to make that clear. Legally, they have the right to use it. And this is very explicit. So I don't know how many of you have been reading this fraud stuff and buying into it, but I gotta tell you, stop, please. It's ridiculous. Let's go on and talk about some other things. Anyway, if you don't think it's ridiculous still, let's talk about it in the question session. This picture shows all of the wasted time writing articles trying to explain why this is wrong. But you just learned it in 10 minutes or something like that. I mean, what else do you need to know? All right, bank run. So everyone knows that, yes, a fractional reserve bank is more vulnerable to runs than a 100% reserve bank. If 100% reserve, I shouldn't even call it a bank, a warehouse. If you have a money warehouse with 100% reserves and everyone decides they want their stuff back at once, well, the warehouse doesn't have any business anymore, but it won't fail, and it has all of the gold or stuff it needs to pay off to meet all of its obligations because it was never supposed to borrow it in the first place. Adam Smith, who was a great defender of fractional reserve banking, and who I'll say more about later on, recognized, as we all should, that of course the foundation of a fractional reserve bank is more fragile. There is the possibility of runs. More eloquently, that, quote, the commerce and industry of the country, it must be acknowledged, though they may be somewhat augmented, I'll explain later the sense in which fractional reserve banking augments the commerce and industry of the country. That is, I'll quote from Smith on that as well, cannot be altogether so secure as when they are thus, as it were, suspended upon the Daedalian wings of paper money, as when they travel about upon the solid ground of gold and silver. So we all agree there is a vulnerability here. There's risk. Well, credit transactions involve risk. We've already determined that the relationship between a depositor and a modern bank and the banker is that of creditor and debtor. So you've got credit, so you've got risk. Hey, what did you expect? It's very low risk most of the time, however, and this is where the real misunderstanding comes in. Most of these narrow banking proponents, it's very interesting to me when it comes to their giving historical justification for narrow banking. They almost always talk about the Great Depression, and then for specifics, you don't have to watch it every year, but it used to play in the United States every year. Okay, yes, Christmas time, right. I once said to somebody, I said, it's a sad fact, but it's remarkably true that a major banking panic in the United States happens, a major bank run happens in the United States almost every year around Christmas time. So they refer to this movie. I don't know what they do in England. I suppose they might refer to Mary Poppins, where there's a bank run. But why are they talking about movies? I'm only being partially facetious. You know the run in Mary Poppins. That's actually a better example because it's a pure panic, right? The kid wants to feed the pigeons, and he wants his tuppence back. Never mind. We shouldn't be talking too much about this, even though advocates of narrow banking do is look at the movie, look what happened in the Jimmy Stewart factory. Let's talk about reality. The reality is that even in the United States, and I'll explain in a moment, that the United States had a much less stable banking system, still does, than many other parts of the world. Even in the Great Depression, bank panics were mainly very isolated, and they were not random. The banks that people ran upon, and this is before deposit insurance was instated in 1933-4, the banks that were run upon were usually failing before the runs. That is, the information came out that the banks were in trouble. Then people tried to get their money because they knew they might not get it if they didn't hurry up, and some people didn't get it. These banks that failed in the thousands were very small banks with few exceptions in agricultural parts of the country, and they were highly under-diversified. But they were failing when they were run upon. It wasn't that fractional reserve banking as such caused them to fail. What caused them to fail was not that they had few reserves. It was that they had bad assets. It's different. And they were under-diversified because at that time until many years later in the United States, most banks in the United States couldn't have any branches. In Italian, it's in French, it's succursale. They couldn't have any. So mostly they're one-town banks. They couldn't even have a branch in the same town. And they're under-diversified, so they fail in the thousands. We know that this lack of branching ability alone was a major cause of failures in the United States, because even the few states that had branch banking, for example, California had branch banking within the state, so that was better than most places. How many banks failed in California during the Depression? None. Canada, to the north, had branch banking nationwide. How many banks failed in Canada during the Depression? None. So we have a problem. We have banks that are failing, and therefore we have bank runs. But the runs are information-based. They're not random. The failures are therefore due to insolvency and bad assets, not to illiquidity, which is a different thing. And therefore, it's simply a mistake to conclude that the case of the bank failures in the United States in the 30s, which, by the way, also were not contagious for the most part. If the bank failed down the street, you might run on the bank nearby, but only if they had very similar characteristics, in which case the bank nearby is probably in trouble too. There was no random panicking, very little evidence of any random panicking. And this is the worst case in the world. There were no runs in many other countries besides Canada. Runs were not a typical phenomenon. But I come back to the movies and all that. When I talk to an advocate of narrow banking, what I find is a narrow mind, in the specific sense that most of these people simply don't know very much economic history. They know or think they know what happened in one country at one time. In fact, they don't know that other countries proved that, in general, fractional reserve banking is not all that vulnerable to runs. We have lots of evidence to show that. Here's a typical article. I shouldn't say that. This is a statement from an article by a guy who knows a little more than most of the advocates of narrow banking, Tenzilidis, in a nice little survey for the most part called "Are Bank Runs Contagious?" Is there this random element in runs where they spread like a germ throughout the economy? And at one point he summarizes things this way, quote, "Historically, the possibility of panics and therefore of contagious panics appears to depend on the structure of the banking system." That's right. That's very important. So it's not an inherent problem with all banking systems. The problem with certain very bad banking systems. And depends on the specific private arrangements designed to prevent such events. Okay, that's good. But then he says, but private arrangements have limitations. Historically, they did not eliminate banking crises altogether. And at this point, I want to, if he were here right now, I'd grab him and start strangling him because, he's wrong. in fact, earlier what he suddenly switched, American economists do it, he switched to talking as if the United States were the whole world. Even in his article, he recognizes that in Canada, there were no crises, there were not even individual bank runs. So it's not true that private arrangements didn't work well there. And there are other countries where they work well. In the United States, private arrangements couldn't possibly make up for all the infirmities due to lack of rent banking. So what he's talking about here is that private arrangements, and there were some very clever ones that tried to make the banking system a little better than it would have been, didn't completely address the problem of crisis. Of course they didn't in the United States. But the United States is not the only example. You have to look at different countries. Then you can get an idea of what's an inherent problem with fractional reserves and what's just a problem with specific arrangements. I mentioned Canada, that was just in case I forgot. But Canada was not the only example. Scotland, which had a very free banking system, and it is not a coincidence, the freest banking systems were the least crisis prone. Decade after decade after decade, it went by, it had not a single bank run. There was only one major banking crisis in Scotland between the 1760s and the 1850s, and then there was something very small in the 1850s, but let's not take it any further. That's a good stretch of time. That's almost a century. Without hardly a bank run. There was, this I should have explained to you, there was a bank run of sorts in Canada, it appears in 2015. Turns out Hallam Capital Group is not a commercial bank at all. So it was one of these, it was like Countrywide, it made mortgages, you know, just special mortgages. And then the story, the more you penetrate into the details, but they hadn't had a bank run still for decades before this thing happened, because their banking system in Canada was still structurally sound. But Scotland is a very good example, very few bank runs. You had the bank crisis of 1772, where the Air Bank went under. And that was quite a disaster. This was a new upstart bank, and they were only in business for a year or two before they got in trouble, because they wanted to become the biggest bank in the world in Scotland and do it really quickly. This is true. So they issued a lot of credit. Their notes were all over the place. Wouldn't you know, they started losing reserves. I don't know why, can't imagine. And pretty soon the other banks would not deal with them anymore. And finally they went under in a spectacular failure. Interestingly enough, though, and they brought down a few smaller banks. Interestingly enough, Scotland recovered very quickly from this crisis. There are three facts about this crisis that are interesting. One is that eventually, despite its massive losses, the Air Bank paid off almost all of its debt. It took a long time, but it paid off almost all of its debt. We recovered relatively quickly from the crisis of 1772, as this quote from William Kerr, his History of Banking Scotland, says, although it was sharp and disastrous in its immediate effects, the crisis passed off more quickly and easily than might have been expected. The harvest of 73 was good, fisheries excellent, blah, blah, blah. Everything was okay in a couple of years, unless you're one of the poor souls who was a shareholder in the Air Bank, and then you were on the hook until it paid off its debt. There's a newish book by Tyler Goodspeed to just finish off the topic of bank runs and crises and panics and how they're not inherent to fractional reserve. New book by Tyler Goodspeed, an excellent book on the Air Bank crisis called Legislating Instability. As if all I've told you about that one Scottish major crisis of that era wasn't enough, Goodspeed shows that if you look closely at what happened in that episode, the only two major government regulations of Scottish banking, which concerned the prohibition of small notes under £1 and the prohibition of so-called option clauses, which allowed banks to suspend payment and pay their notes in 6 months, contributed to the crisis. So government actually was somewhat at fault in this episode. Okay. Let's talk about, one more point, yeah. In general, banking systems are fragile, not because they have fractional reserves, but for other reasons, and mainly because of unwise regulatory restrictions. And this has been excellently documented, this fact, generalization, is excellently documented in the book Fragile by Design by Charles Calomiris and Stephen Haber. If you want to read a shorter version of the same thesis, in 1989, I wrote an article called Legal Restrictions, Financial Weakening, and the Lender of Last Resort, which makes essentially the same point that Calomiris and Haber do, and with examples, so obviously not as extensive as them. All right, inflation, fractional reserves and inflation. I'm going to cover this very quickly because it's a matter, the argument is essentially a matter of simple algebra, with one exception. If you assume you start in a world where everybody's using coins, and suddenly some bankers get the bright idea that we're going to have fractional reserve banking, and we're going to let people use our notes, and we're going to only keep the coins we need to keep to meet occasional demands. In going from, well, let's say in the new banking system, you're going to have 10% reserves. In the transition from the pure gold coin system to the 10% reserve fractional reserve banking system, you're basically going to be able to dispose of 90% of the gold, because you can make the money, you can have the same money stock with 90% less gold. You can export it, whatever. If you're in a small open economy like Scotland, actually even that transition won't affect the price level or the inflation rate very much. If you're in a world, if you do this for the whole world, guess what? Prices are going to rise because the price of gold is going to fall, and gold is your monetary standard unit. So yes, in the transition from a non-fractional reserve to a fractional reserve system, if it all happens at once in the world or in a big country, you will have some increase in prices. But the point I want to address, which I think is more important, is whether once you have an established fractional reserve system, the fact that you have fractional reserves means you're going to have more ongoing inflation. And that's just not true. And a little algebra can show that very easily. So, oops, that's just to remind you that we're talking about inflation. So let's just start with some simple equations. The money supply is equal to the quantity of reserves divided times the reciprocal of the reserve ratio. Okay. In this simple example, I'm assuming that all money consists of fractionally backed banknotes and deposits, no gold circulating. So little r is the reserve ratio. We have our equation of exchange. The money supply times its velocity equals the price level times the amount of output in the world. We do a little substitute. We do now the rate of change. The rate of growth of the money supply plus the rate of growth of velocity equals the rate of change of the price level. That's the inflation rate plus the rate. Sorry, that should be minus sign. It should be minus the rate of growth of output. Right. And now we've reversed some terms here. And now we have an equation for inflation, and we substitute. Okay. The thing that's significant about this is that, as you can see, it's not the level of the reserve ratio that matters. It's the rate of change. So yes, if you have a fractional reserve system where the reserve ratio is declining, that's going to give you higher prices, other things equal. But the rate of inflation does not depend on the absolute value of the reserve ratio. It doesn't depend on it. So if R, not the slanted one, but the regular R, the value of R were 10%. Let's say you have two banking systems otherwise alike in two countries. One has a reserve ratio of 10%, one has a reserve ratio of 50%, and in both cases the quantity of reserves is growing 10% a year. The other variables in the equation of exchange are constant. What's the inflation rate going to be in each case? Inflation rate does not depend on the reserve ratio. Simple as that. So if you want to argue that fractional reserve banking systems cause more inflation, ratios tend to decline over time, you could try to make that case, except that there's just no truth to it. Yes, it's true that over long stretches of time, banking systems become more efficient, they discover ways to economize and reserve, but this is very, very gradual generally. the earliest statistics we have on reserve ratios, say for the gold, the 1650s, suggest reserve ratios back then of perhaps 30%. It's already pretty low. If you go to the most efficient English and Scottish banking system of the, say, 1830s or 40s, you're down to about 5%. But that's almost 2 centuries for this transition takes place. And in fact, of course, there was no massive inflation at the time. This actual historical progress didn't lead to any significant inflation. Now, there's a different question about cyclical behavior, and this is going to relate to the business cycle as much as to the question of inflation itself. And there, the question is whether you have much significant inflation related to temporary declines in the reserve ratio. I've studied business booms, historical famous booms in boom-bust cycles. And I've looked to see what was driving the booms. I took all the most notorious ones and I focused on gold standard or silver specie standard pre-fiat money era, because I think it's more revealing. And I found in every case of every famous boom that it wasn't decline in reserve ratios of the competitive private banks that was contributing to the boom. In every case, it was an increase in reserves of the banks. Either gold and silver themselves were flowing in, or in countries with central banks, the central bank was creating reserves that the other banks were using. It was not a decline in reserve ratios. And if you're interested in the details, my paper pointing this out and showing the evidence is called Bank Lending Manias in Theory and History. Okay, business cycle. This one is complicated, I suppose. I'm going to try to keep it simple. And here Mises certainly took the view that fractional reserve banking was a bad thing. He argues in a famous footnote in Human Action, quote, the issuance of additional fiduciary media, that's any bank money not backed by reserves, no matter what its quantity may be, always sets in motion those changes in the price structure, the description of which is the task of the theory of the trade cycle. And you can see how someone Mises is in the anti-fractional reserve camp. And there are other quotes that suggest otherwise, but that's why I put a big red question mark over Mises' picture. Well, I'd like to encourage people, I already have done this in a blog post. It's fine to read von Mises, but there are other economists, including all other Austrian economists, who I think are actually better on this subject of what's appropriate or safe or non-cyclical fiduciary media creation. The best of whom, in my opinion, was one of Mises' students, Fritz Macklin, who I actually took some classes with. In his book, Stock Market Credit, and I'll read it to you. It's tedious to try to read it, but then I'll explain its significance. Macklin writes in that book that, quote, I use the term transfer credit if the purchasing power accruing to the borrower from bank lending is counterbalanced by purchasing power foregone by somebody else, such as a voluntary saver or disinvesting producer. My term transfer credit corresponds to Mises' term commodity credit. For Mises' term circulation credit, I have substituted the term created credit, which clearly conveys the meaning that the purchasing power accruing to the borrower from bank lending again is not counterbalanced by any purchasing power foregone by anybody else. Now, the significance of this passage is not exactly obvious, because Macklin is claiming or suggesting that he's merely changing Mises' terminology. Mises says commodity credit, Macklin says transfer credit. Mises says circulation credit, Macklin says created credit. But that's not all that's going on here. Macklin actually defines the terms differently. The word commodity credit already suggests to you, as it should, and I think as it was meant to, that for Mises, it's only, I don't know how to quite explain this, it's credit based on 100% reserves or with no fiduciary media. That's genuine savings, and that's okay. Except the problem is, if you have 100% reserves, and if you have commodity backing, you don't have any credit. You don't have any lending. So we're back to the extreme Rothbard position, or we're back to the position consistent with the Mises quote you just saw, right? But for Maclub, what matters isn't whether there's gold backing for the liabilities of the banks. It's whether the extra fiduciary media that was created, that added to the purchasing power of the borrowers, a reduction in spending by savers, voluntary savings. That's transfer credit. If the banks are putting more purchasing power in there, but no one else is refraining from using their purchasing power, that is, saving voluntarily, that's creating credit. And that is different from Mises, and it's correct. I have a picture by which I will try to convince you. Yes, it's a good old-fashioned circular flow diagram. They use those here out there, too, in textbooks. Circular flow diagrams. Oh, you don't know what you're missing if you haven't seen it. So it's very nice, actually. You've got the households, very simple model. It's a macroeconomic model, by the way. Don't worry. This one's easy. It's not a DSG model. The households and the firms, usually you have two circles flowing in opposite directions. Right? The circuit that's not shown here is the circuit of real resources. So labor goes from the households to the firms. Goods go from the firms to the households. What you see here is the flow of money payments. So here we have households buying stuff from firms with money, so money flows toward the firms, and the firms are buying labor from the households. So money is flowing around this circular flow. Now, here's the thing. This is an aggregate model. This is macro, right? So this is all households and all firms. Bad things happen if the circular flow shrinks or gets bigger. Let's just talk about the case where it shrinks, because that's more obvious, right? Firms have expended a certain amount of historical cost. They've incurred a historical cost because they've paid a lot for labor. Everything hinges on the households returning the same amount to the firms, because if they don't get at least that much back, they can't cover their bills. It's not complicated. That means that the average firm is going to be losing money, and that doesn't do anybody any good. That we might call that a recession. It's okay if some firms are losing and some firms are gaining. That's all right. If the aggregate, we want to be even. But if there's a general decline in expenditures, as it were, a leakage from the circular flow, then we're going to have trouble. And not a kind of trouble that signifies the need to reallocate resources. It's a liquidity problem. Okay, that's a lesson in macroeconomics. So what happens if people stop spending their gold coins or whatever, right? So they withdraw from the circular flow. Well, it's okay if you have a proper fractional reserve bank or whatever, because this is Maclub's transfer credit, right? People take out, the bank puts it back in, if the bank gets the money. And so the circular flow is maintained. We don't have a recession, and that's great. That's transfer credit. But what if you have a warehouse instead? In that case, that's the end of the line, right? They store the money, it comes out. So you don't have transfer credit when you should. You have an inadequate amount of purchasing power being introduced into the circular flow to offset voluntary savings that might have been used for that purpose. And that can be legally used if they're deposited at a proper fractional reserve bank. Now, I didn't show in this picture the case where you have a bank that puts money in even though no one's taking it out. That would be an example of credit creation. And that would be inflationary and would cause business cycles. I'm not showing you that because my point is simply that there are situations where the creation of fiduciary media is actually essential to stabilize the business cycle, in this case by preventing a shortage of liquidity from causing a recession or a depression. And you can't do that with a commodity standard. With this, if we can go back to this case, eventually what will happen here is that savings and investment will be equalized in the long run. But it'll happen through a decline in the price level or an increase in the purchasing power of gold, and then you'll be back to business. All the prices that firms charge, all those things have to decline a little bit, and then they can make do with a reduced flow of monetary expenditures. That process of adjustment, though, takes time. When we have recessions, it's because you're waiting for prices to do their thing. You know, a recession due to a liquidity shortage. So that's all I have to say about business cycles. We can talk about it more. I wanted to take the rest of my time because we're almost up, right? Am I a little late? A little late. I'm almost done. I wanted to say some nice things about fractional reserve banking and not just defend it from these various accusations made against it. I've already said that in principle, fractional reserve systems are capable of dampening business cycles. I've suggested, I think, that they're more economical, but the most important point I want to make is that fractional reserve banking has contributed historically immensely to economic growth. Adam Smith once again had it right. If you haven't read book 2, chapter 2 of The Wealth of Nations on money, you are missing some of the best discussion of monetary economics in the economics literature as a whole. Let me just summarize what Smith says there, in part. Well, the gold and silver money which circulated in any country may very properly be compared to a highway which, while it circulates and carries to market all the grass and corn of the country, produces itself not a single pile of either. The judicious operations of banking, by proving, if I may be allowed so violent a metaphor, a sort of wagon way through the air, enables the country to convert, as it were, a great part of the highway into good pastures and cornfields, thereby increasing very considerably the annual produce of land and labor. Okay, just to make clear what he's saying, here's a cornfield. Let's suppose corn is the only valuable good in society. We'd like to plant every acre of the planet in corn or maize or whatever. This is what we Americans call wheat, they call it corn. But the way with the technology we have, you have to have a road, otherwise you can't get the wheat or the corn or whatever it is. But what if we could harvest from the air? Today we would say have a helicopter harvester, right? Then we could plant that part too, and we could have that much more. Same thing with money. We use gold and silver, real resources are bound up in them as our medium of exchange. That's valuable labor and effort went into mining the gold, etc., and it's not producing anything else. What if instead we could use little bits of paper, we could use the gold to make ornaments and get utility out of it other ways, or export it to some other countries that still use this stuff, and we have a banking system with fractional reserves, where the bank's assets consist mostly of productive loans. It'll contribute, you're getting all the savings that were to be invested only in the gold and silver mining efforts are now invested in industrial activities of all kinds, not to mention occasional consumer loans, etc. In the course of time from around 1700, or around the time of the Act of Union with England, until 1850 or so, Scotland went from having a per capita income roughly half that of England to having more or less the same per capita income by the end of that period. And though there were many factors involved, the banking system of Scotland, which was far more efficient than the English system and resulted in far more savings in gold and silver, was clearly a major factor. Even in 1776, Smith recognized that the banking system was really helping Scotland develop. The history of Scotland had been, the banks have contributed a good deal to this increase, cannot be doubted. Well, if it was obvious in 1776, it became still more so later on. Rhonda Cameron, wonderful economic historian from Emory University, wrote this book and another companion work on banking and economic development. This one is banking in the early stages of industrialization, where he very strongly affirms Smith's conclusion with all kinds of geometric evidence. And other chapters cover other countries. The basic conclusion of the book is fractional reserve banking has been an absolutely crucial factor in the industrialization of the modern world and an important contributor still, where it's allowed, to economic growth and development. We'd all be much, much poorer without it. And that is the case for fractional reserves, except I have one last slide. This slide is here to remind me to say, I'm not defending each and every actual fractional reserve bank. Some of them, I won't mention any names, are really, really awful. So this is not a defense of a particular institution. It's a defense of a principle based on the fact that in the right setting, with the right regulations, which is to say not many regulations at all, fractional reserve banking can be a great boon to society, which would be far, far worse without. Thank you very much.